Well, this week on Behind the Headlines, we are going to be talking about trees. And I have with me here Dave Dockter, Managing Arborist for the City of Palo Alto, and Catherine Martineau, who is the Executive Director of our local nonprofit, Canopy. So welcome, Catherine and Dave. And I just want to ask you a few questions about, first of all, let's talk a little bit about the number of trees that we have in our urban area. Can you tell me both on a city level and, on the city-owned trees, and also just a sense of how many there are even on private property in aggregate?
Well, I can speak to the city-owned trees that has increased from 31,000 up to 40,000 now, thanks to Canopy and City Council's planting programs that we've had in the last decade. And then private property, Catherine, I don't know, what do you think?
On private property, it's kind of difficult to tell. Frankly, we haven't yet counted them. But we have a sense that in general, the street trees represent approximately 10% of the overall forest in the urban matrix. However, I think that maybe in Palo Alto, because we have so many public trees, maybe it's a little more. Maybe so. I think maybe probably about 300,000 trees altogether in the Palo Alto urban forest, in the valley floor, in the urban matrix.
No, that's quite a lot of trees. How does Palo Alto compare to other cities? Do you have any ideas?
Palo Alto compares pretty well to other cities because the overall tree canopy cover, that's another measure that we have. So basically when you get on a plane and you look from above, you can get a sense of how well the city is covered with tree canopy. Overall, we're at about 38%. However, there are disparities even within Palo Alto. South Palo Alto has an 11 percentage points different compared to North Palo Alto, and we're actually lower number. And there are various reasons for that, and we're starting to address this in partnership with the city.
What are some of the reasons behind that, do you think?
Well, the South Palo Alto has been developed more recently than Old Palo Alto and North Palo Alto in general. And in the beginning, before settlement, basically, this area was an oak-studded savanna. So there were native oaks, there were oak woodland areas, there were also some riparian corridors with riparian trees, native trees, of course. So there weren't that many trees in Palo Alto per se. With development, people have brought trees. It's much better to live in a very green and shaded environment, and that's something that we know instinctively. There is now a lot of science that tells us why. So people brought trees and they planted them and they've grown, and that's how we get to this level of tree canopy cover. Around Palo Alto, some communities have very good canopy cover. Atherton, for example, West Menlo Park is pretty good. And some other communities are disadvantaged in that respect, like East Palo Alto. That's why Canopy works so much in East Palo Alto to plant trees there.
Right. How many trees would you say, do you have a count of how many trees Canopy has planted in Palo Alto?
So we've planted, the organization was founded 20 years ago, and we've planted altogether 4,300 trees.
Really? Seriously?
Really?
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing.
And I would say less than half in Palo Alto, and the rest mostly in East Palo Alto.
Okay. So when we talk about trees, I think it's kind of an interesting thing that we've talked about before is you mentioned the native oaks, and this is an oak-studded area, but people bring in trees as well. They bring in the trees that they like, correct? And we've planted a lot of those, and has that kind of gotten us in some trouble now where either the trees have matured or they don't do that well here? Can you tell us a little bit about that in terms of just, have we had to remove a lot of those types of trees because they're not suited?
Oh, of course, and I think this is growing pains that every city has gone through, actually, is that as time has gone on over 100 years, there's always been a favorite tree. It seems like both with the city, street trees, and boy, we are sorry we've planted some, that have done so much damage. And we all know that leaf litter and stuff that comes down from some of the trees is just a real pain. But boy, they sure are beautiful, some of them. But we've learned to jettison more bothersome trees or things that are not really fit the space well. Some trees are just too big for our yards. So we see a lot of tree removal happening both on the city land and on private property. And our ordinance is geared for allowing the older, less adaptive trees we're looking to adapt to new species, better Mediterranean climate things from the drier climates of the world. We're finding that they can grow just perfectly here and just happy, and it's the right thing. So,
Yes, so if I may interrupt,
Sure.
Please.
I would like to talk about the drought in particular. And
Right.
we have a forest that still is dominated by species that need supplemental irrigation in the summer. These are species that were brought, by residents and by the people who live here because they love those trees. So, for example, magnolias. We have amazing stands of magnolias in the city of Palo Alto. Magnolias are a southern swamp type tree. They really do not belong here. And as long as we thought that we had an unlimited supply of water, they might have made sense, maybe. However, they don't work that well any longer. But they are here, they provide lots of services. So the idea is to transition the forest to a much more climate adapted forest. And one effort that we are starting to do is to re-oak Palo Alto, to start replanting the native oaks. We've lost quite a few of the very large ones, and we need to start replenishing the oaks.
Okay, and so when we talk about, we talk about native plants, but there's one particular tree that is native but is not suited for this area.
I know where you're going with this.
It's a very sensitive topic, and that is the redwood. So we just recently had, in fact, had to take down a large redwood, right, at Castellea School. So I believe it was about 120 feet, but it had some problems. And there was also a lot of concern amongst residents. They didn't quite understand it because it looked, on the surface when you just walk by it, had a nice big lush canopy. So let's talk a little bit about that kind of tree and why it's not suited for here, and what happened with this particular tree.
Well, Catherine, maybe if you wanted to talk about, let's split this up a little bit,
Okay.
because it's a big topic,
Yeah.
really relevant to our residents. The community really wants to know about how do we deal with these gigantic forest species in a subdivision or a developed yard area. And then the danger part, I can talk
You can
about
address that. Okay.
Yeah, I
split
think
that up.
there are two questions here,
Yeah.
Sue. One is whether it is appropriate to plant redwoods in the flat, in Palo Alto urban areas. And, they are native to California, definitely. They are native to our region, and we see their range is being threatened by climate change. So, and they're an amazing species. The problem is that they need a lot of water, and they probably need 10 times as much water as we get naturally from rainfall here. And also they thrive in areas where the fog is present, and we don't have any fog here. So they have been planted a lot because they grow very fast, they're majestic, they're beautiful. You just water them and they'll grow. The issue is that we don't have as much water as we used to. We know not only do we have the drought, but we also need to conserve water in terms of the overall use, priority use of the water supply we are allotted. So that's one that's one aspect of the problem. But and one of the things we can do is tell people not to plant redwood and offer some substitute species options. So that's something that Canopy does. But then the problem of this particular tree is different. It was not removed because it doesn't belong. We have beautiful redwoods in the city. There's no question that we should keep them as long as they function and as long as they're safe. And that's where, Dave, you can talk about the safety
Right.
or lack thereof for this particular tree.
Yes.
Yes, when the tree ordinance actually allows for removal of problem trees, and there's a whole list of exemptions in the tree ordinance. And one of them is if a tree is dangerous, then a tree removal permit can be issued for that tree. So when we get report that a tree is dangerous, then the property owner usually has that evaluated by an arborist, and the arborist looks at it. A tree that can be very healthy, like the Castellana redwood, it can have a big leaf area. It's got some functioning tissues, but it doesn't mean that it's perfectly sound, and the structure can hold itself up. So tree health and tree stability and structure are two different things.
Two
So
different things, right.
the professional arborist tends to look at a tree, separate it into two worlds, and say, okay, is the tree healthy and if it's got a leaf area, but the structure is a whole different way we look at the tree. So when a tree removal permit that, for instance, urban forestry reviews, we look at the health and structure as a very, very important two different elements, and we want the consultants to look at that. In the case of the Castellana redwood, the basal area was very, very rotten with lots of bark was missing, and that's an evidence that decay has eroded the internal structure, the bones of the tree, if you will. And that tree had a potential actually for the whole tree to topple over, and it wasn't up in the upper green, the green leafy area. So the green leafy area and the upper parts of the tree are just not that worrisome. In that case, the problem area that we always must target is where would the tree fail. This tree, it was at the base. Other trees, when we look at oaks, it might be a long branch. And for some of the tree removal permits that actually get submitted to us, that we actually say, well, have you considered pruning the tree to reduce so that the residual risk is entirely okay? So you've removed the danger of a broken branch. That's a different scenario than the redwood. But we look at the health of a tree and the structure of a tree. We separate those out. And in this case of the redwood, the structure of the tree was deemed to be an untenable risk to keep around.
Right, and one of the other issues, I was reading through your tree technical manual a little bit and saw that there's many other factors that you have to consider, right? Such as wind and things like that. So when you're looking at a tree that it might not do as well, it might be worse off if you've got a lot of wind coming through, let's say in winter storms. And wasn't that one of the issues with this one, is that there was a lot of concern that it really couldn't stand much longer, and it was a liability if we had a good storm and the wind might cause it to topple. So these are all different aspects of it.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. And it culminated to where somebody needed to make a decision. Did it meet that threshold? Yes. For normal conditions, it still posed a pretty high risk of whole tree toppling because the roots were decaying, and at some point, the forces above ground are more than the tree can actually support itself at ground or below ground. And the tree could have toppled. So it was pretty evident to both the city arborist who looked at the tree, the reports, and we agreed.
Yeah.
So to milk any more time out of keeping that tree around would be more or less of a gamble on the property owner. Hold your breath, and when.
Right.
Because we cannot stop decay that
Right.
it just erodes wood tissues.
But there's also a whole issue of the target of the tree, and that's something that arborists also look at, I understand. And that is, if you have trees out in the next to the creek where there may not be a lot of people walking by, and you might see a gnarly old oak tree with not a very lush canopy on it. It looks like it's on its way out. It's got lots of holes in the trunk, but it's not going to hit anybody, right? And so these are other considerations that you have to take when you're looking at trees as well, when you're evaluating them?
Many, many things. In the tree technical manual that the city's created for every property owner, there's a whole checklist of what to look for and advice for arborists, what to look for. Again, we're trained in this technique of evaluating risk with trees, with natural living things, and it's becoming more and more of an art and science, but it takes a lot of experience to bring to the table to evaluate wind, rot, decay, this thing that we've heard of, a lingo tuber on the Castanea redwood. A lot of people have not heard that before, that term, but it's important to know that just rot and decay kind of will go through most tree parts when it has an opportunity. So keeping trees healthy is a real core thing.
Right. And so when you also arborists, it's not a subjective thing, right? I mean, you're not looking at the tree and just saying, I think that tree's going to come down. You really are trained, and tell us a little bit. You have some technical manuals, I gather, that you follow. You're certified. Tell us a little bit about that. You have to follow a lot of procedures before these trees come down, or even that they're maintained. So we've pretty much just talked about removal of trees, but there's also the maintenance of trees that perfectly healthy and can survive with a little bit of coaxing along.
Yeah, the one thing it's important to understand is every city around is obligated to have a clear process to let the community know what is the criteria that we use to make decisions. And even though there are subjective parts to evaluating a tree, we all do fall back to what is the standard in the industry. We've created a tree technical manual that we've told everybody we use certain criteria that we actually defer to, or we actually reference. The International Society of Arboriculture has a best management practice for evaluating tree risk hazard, or to determine if a tree is hazardous or not. And so that's the basis in the industry that we hold to within professional city arborists, and the reports that we review, like this Castanea redwood, we made sure that industry standard was within that arborist report. So the methodology is consistent with how we look at trees. And we are very, very actually fair how we've evaluated trees, and I'm amazed that over 20 years that the tree ordinance has been in existence, we have denied very few requests. I think it's probably 98% of the requests that the city has gotten, we've approved removals because they've met the criteria. And the ones that we haven't approved, it's because the tree could be pruned or somehow reduce the risk, and then we live with a beautiful environmental asset.
Yes, excuse me, yes. And I think that this is because arborists, consulting arborists, tree care companies know that in Palo Alto, there is a process and it's pretty stringent, and they know that they cannot get away with a less than excellent report to make the case for removal. That's very specific to Palo Alto, and this is really to the credit of Dave and the city to have put that in place. I do know, however, some cases where someone wanted to remove a redwood tree and could not obtain a permit from the city and would appeal to Canopy to try to get their case made. So I know personally I have seen a lot of thoroughness in the part of the city to make sure that no tree is removed for the wrong reason. And Canopy is really comfortable with the people that we have in place. And as far as the private arborists who create those reports, they many of them are consulting arborists. They abide by certain professional code of conduct. So
That's right.
Dave mentioned the ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture, but there's also the American Society of Consulting Arborists, ASCA, and they have a very strict code of conduct. And in my more than 10 years at Canopy, I have not seen any arborists that seem to be not abiding by these ethical rules. I'm sure there are some, but I haven't seen that happen in the context of visible tree removal in Palo Alto.
Yeah, I just want to touch on something. I know we don't have too much more time, but I wanted to find out a little bit about, there are often, we have a lot of development pressures in Palo Alto, and people now, are building their houses out to the maximum that they can on the lots. And so this issue comes up. I've gotten calls from people many times. Somebody's removing this big redwood. The city is allowing them to do it. It's only for the purpose of development. So if somebody could kind of address, either one of you, that whole issue about, the city, what's the city's position or related to development in terms of, allowing these trees? You're not really just letting them be cut down, right? Just for the sake of development. So that's kind of.
I hope not.
So we can maybe talk a little bit about the checks and balances regarding that.
Well, yeah, lay opinion, just lifting up the rug and driving by, for instance, I could think that, oh my gosh, there goes development again, removing another big protected tree.
And that was the
redwood
case with the Castanea tree as well, because it was supposedly standing in the way of development.
Yeah. However, this is the good thing about Palo Alto is that it may seem like a subjective decision, but every tree that gets removed still has to meet the criteria set up in the tree ordinance. And no property owner gets to just remove a protected tree and put a house footprint on top of the tree.
And when we talk about protected trees, we're talking about redwoods and two species of oaks, right?
Yes, valley oaks, coast live oaks, and coast redwoods.
Okay.
To remove one of those three species, it must meet the criteria in the code. And the code does not allow for removal, put a building on top of that space that the tree occupied, and then buy the tree and plant some trees somewhere else later.
Right.
That a lot of cities do that, but Palo Alto has set up to where no, those trees are evaluated if it meets the criteria, dangerous, hazardous, or there's other exemptions that are articulated in the code for really crowded sites that have more than one tree. There's a lot of protected trees around. There's an ability to alleviate an encumbered site with careful permit to remove and replace if it's too crowded, because we don't want to overcrowd any lot. And if a big redwood is taking up an entire lot and you can't build, there's a provision in the code for that, to consider removal, replacement somehow, because it's not the intent of the tree ordinance to be a taking of a lot.
Right, and probably legally
to prevent,
you can't.
we can't legally,
Right.
no. So the tree ordinance has very, very good, important exemptions that have to be administered by a good pro like the urban forester and working with the property owner. And frankly, cities around all over keep coming to Palo Alto to ask, how are you guys doing it? Because we have this value system here where when development happens, we go in very carefully, work with architect, developer, and arborists, are core players in the early setting up of our development. And that is the envy of many, many, many cities. But it takes resources, it takes planning, and I got to say, we're doing it pretty well, the best we can, for single-family residences and large commercial sites and such.
Okay. So we're getting to the end, but I want to ask you, Catherine, a little bit about education of the public, because, Canopy is
Best.
advocates advocates for retaining and expanding the tree canopy. So can you tell us a little bit about what resources people will have available to them through your organization?
Yes, so we have many different resources. Our website is certainly one central place where people can find information. So for example, one service that we offer is an arborist list. So if someone needs a tree assessed or some work done, there is a database of local arborists that are certified and that are deemed good professionals that you can query to find the right arborist for your project. So this is, it's easy to find. If you go to canopy.org, you can then navigate to the arborist list very easily. Another tool we have is another database. It's a database of, I think we have about 300 tree species that can be found around here in Palo Alto in particular, and that are discussed. And you can also query this database in order to make the right species selection for your own planting in your backyard or front yard. So these are amazing resources that I encourage people to go to. We also offer seminars and workshops. We have a newsletter that contains tree relevant information. It's a monthly newsletter. On top of all of this, we also are we try to do our best to educate the public on what to do with their trees during the drought. We had some rains recently. Thank goodness, we're very happy about this, but the drought is probably not over, and it's going to take some time for the trees to recover. So when you remove your lawn to conserve water and you replace it with a landscape that is more that is drier, you have to look at your trees. Go to the Canopy website and look at the type of tree you have, what kind of watering, supplemental watering it may need, and you can actually do this by using very little water. The trees don't use a lot of water, but they just need enough, especially during a drought, to survive. They bring us so many benefits. We don't want to lose them because we're skimping on water that they absolutely need. So it's really a matter of priority. When we have a scarce resource, we need to make decisions on where to use it. Not using it on the lawn, perfect sense, makes perfect sense. But just know how to water smartly.
And also, I think the city as well does offer a lot of possibilities for education, and for you have workshops and that sort of thing when trees have to come down. Is that correct?
When trees have to come down,
Yeah.
we have a noticing program where we put a notice actually on the physical tree so that people are aware of what changes in the neighborhood. And for watering, we have a whole new landscape guidelines for the green building. So when homes and businesses are converting from old high water use landscapes to lower water use, what Catherine said is so important to first water the trees and keep your water supplied to the main dominant landscape features. Shrubs, lawn, turf, that can be replaced at any point in time. But Palo Alto learned a lot of lessons from the 1980s when water was shut off, everything died, even the big landscape trees, and what a loss. So we're in much better shape during this drought than we were in the past. So thanks to Canopy, though. Canopy's been a real leader regionally for water and tree care savvy.
Well, I guess this just about wraps up today, and I want to thank our guests, both Dave and Catherine. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you, Sue. I think we had a really interesting discussion. We need more time to talk about trees in Palo Alto. It's an important topic, and I hope we get together again and continue the conversation.
Okay.
We'll be there for you.
And you can find us on Twitter at Palo Alto Weekly. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.